Well, welcome to this evening's event. I'm Michael Spence, the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Sydney. It is a tremendous privilege to welcome you here, and in doing so, I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodianship of the land on which we meet. This land belongs to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, always has and always will do. We're proud at the University of Sydney that people have been teaching and learning here in the Sydney Basin for tens of thousands of years, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. Well, the connection between the University of Sydney and the United Nations is deep and old. We're very proud of the fact that H.V. Evatt was the third president of the General Assembly, and even more proud that he was one of the people who helped draft the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We're proud of the fact that hundreds of our staff and students continue to work with, on and in projects funded by the United Nations and its agencies. It's tremendous to welcome visitors, always from the United Nations. In 2011, Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General, and this evening was Helen Clark, the Administrator of the United Nations Development Programme, and it is terrific to have you with us, Ms. Clark. It's not surprising that that connection is strong. When the university was founded, it was founded with a radical vision to serve the people of New South Wales and the world more generally. It was founded as a place committed to the common good, as a place that understood that political institutions and educational institutions only have a right to exist in that they make our lives better, make our lives richer, make our lives in one way or other more meaningful. And that shared goal brings these institutions together. Well, the work of the United Nations Development Programme is certainly committed to human flourishing, and it is a great privilege to introduce Ms. Clark. She became Administrator of the UNDP in April 2009 and is the first woman to lead the organisation. She is also Chair of the United Nations Development Group, a committee consisting of the heads of all UN funds, programmes and departments working on development issues. Prior to her appointment with the UNDP, Helen Clark served for 9 years as Prime Minister of New Zealand, serving 3 successive terms from 1999 to 2008. And I was hearing from our Dean of Nursing and Midwifery about how she revolutionised midwifery practice in the country and took it years ahead of the rest of the world. Throughout her tenure as Prime Minister, Helen Clark engaged widely in policy development and advocacy across the international, economic, social and cultural spheres. Under her leadership, New Zealand achieved significant economic growth, low levels of unemployment and high levels of investment in education and health and in the well-being of families and older citizens. She and her government prioritised reconciliation and the settlement of historical grievances with New Zealand's First People and the development of an inclusive, multicultural and multi-faith society. And that's why you're here, because she knows what she's talking about, and it's a privilege to have her here with us. The format of this evening is that Ms. Clark will speak for 40 minutes, and then there'll be an opportunity for people to ask her questions in an open microphone. And she is going to be speaking to us on the topic of the rise of the South, human progress in a diverse world. Would you join me in welcoming her to the stage?
Thank you, Vice-Chancellor, and good evening, everybody, and thank you to the University for asking me to deliver the Sydney Ideas Distinguished Speaker lecture. I gave some thought to what I should talk about here in this lecture, having talked about health and development over for the Sydney University Medical Society last night. But tonight I'm painting a rather broader canvas talking about the rise of the South, what's behind it, what could be a challenge to further rises in human development, and also looking more broadly at the global development challenges faced by every country. It's not just an issue of poor countries facing challenges, rich countries face them as well. And that will lead me to talk a little bit about the new global development agenda that will follow on from the Millennium Development Goals. But on the issue of the rise of the South, where I start, my attention was drawn in July to an article in The Economist, which was titled, "When Giants Slow Down." And it was talking about the dramatically rapid growth of the emerging economies over the past 20 years or so, particularly the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and described this as the biggest economic transformation in modern history. Also went on to say, but haven't we reached an important inflection point where these emerging giants are going to grow larger and their ranks will swell, there will be more such countries, but their tread will no longer shake the earth as it once did. And I was rather taken by this image because giants treading the earth and shaking it is a rather powerful image, but also one that creates some fear. And I guess my starting point is there is nothing to be fearful of. This is very positive, what is happening with the rise of the emerging economies, and it has the potential to contribute a great deal to the development of other countries, including Australia, which is both, as I will argue, a beneficiary of and a contributor to the rise of the emerging economies. We can see the impact of some of the contributions of this emerging global South in examples like that of China. Millennium Development Goal 1, set in the year 2000, challenged the global community to halve global poverty by 2015 over 1990 levels. That goal has been met. How has it been met? Largely because China lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. What this tells us is when China moves, the scale of the country is such that this is of global importance. And that will be as true for the reduction of its carbon footprint as it has been for poverty reduction. But of course, China moving, China's growing prosperity creates opportunities for others. The demand of its large and growing middle class has benefited many economies, not least that of Australia. Another sort of very significant impact from a large emerging economy, the Indian generic drugs industry produced more than 80% of the medicines used to treat AIDS in programs supported by the big donor organisations like the Global Fund between 2003 and 2008. The sheer scale of this industry in a very large emerging economy has made essential medicines more affordable, more accessible. This is a huge contribution to development. And then I thought of the example of Brazil, another of the major emerging economies. Last year, there was a major UN conference in Brazil, Rio +20, on sustainable development. And prior to Rio +20, the member states of the United Nations had argued and argued and argued about what the outcome of the conference could be. Couldn't reach any decisions. They went to Rio, and it was there at Rio that Brazil takes the chair on the negotiations and has the geopolitical clout and the respect to broker an agreement. So this is another example of the kind of influence a powerful emerging economy can have on our world. One also thinks of the impact of the emerging economies through the global financial crisis. Actually, where would we have been without the fast-growing developing regions of the world, which have often carried the burden of global growth in recent years? The truth is that the North and the South do need each other to do well. And the countries of the North have very much needed sustained demand out of the developing economies to sustain their own position. Now, this whole subject of the rise of the South, the move to convergence and development, is one which UNDP's annual Global Human Development Report looked at this year. What is behind this incredible transformation of a number of developing countries into dynamic economies with rising human development? We don't just look at the growth in the economy, we look at what is happening to the people. Is there benefit from the people? So you have this group of countries, yes, dynamic economies, yes, rising human development, and many with growing geopolitical influence. And we're talking here not just about the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. We're talking Turkey, we're talking Mexico, we're talking a range of significant economies in this region that Australia looks out to, Indonesia, Korea, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam. Our report looked at successful policies in countries which had greater gains in human development than would have been predicted from their previous performance, and looks at how they achieved that. And what it finds is that you saw a combination of openness to trade and investment, very pragmatic economic policies, and very innovative and inclusive social policy. This adds up to proactive developmental states which are looking to advance on both the economic and social dimensions. But this whole dynamism behind the emerging economies is also underpinned by what is an historic expansion of trade and investment within the developing country world itself. Their share of world merchandise trade is increasing tremendously. Foreign direct investment from developing countries going to other developing countries has been growing around 20% per annum over the last 15 or more years. Global foreign exchange reserves. There are deep pockets in the South. And if you look at the amount of funds in sovereign wealth funds around the world, 3/4 of them are controlled by funds in the South. So this is a different world from the world we knew in the 70s and the 80s. And it's contributing to what I said was a process of convergence in levels of human development between the North and the South. That reflects the faster growth in GDP per capita and the increased health and education provision in developing countries. As I said, Australia is itself a beneficiary of and a contributor to this. This country's positive trade performance over the last 20 years, growing by around 7.5% per annum on average, is largely attributed to its economic relationship with a fast-growing Asia. And today, not only is China Australia's largest trading partner, but Korea, Singapore, India, Thailand and Malaysia are among its top 10. We wouldn't have been looking at that 20 years ago. Again, if we're looking at economic power shifts, our projections in the Human Development Report are that by 2020, which isn't so far away, the combined economic output in 1990, purchasing power parity dollars, of China, India and Brazil alone will be greater than that of the G7 minus Japan. This is huge scale in the economic output and wealth of the South. And again, while the definition is a little bit loose, projections are that by 2030, 80% of those categorised as middle class in the world will live in developing countries, with South Asia, East Asia Pacific region accounting for about 60% of this global middle class. It's often said in real estate, location, location, location. I think we could say of Australia and New Zealand, location, location, location. We are in the right region in terms of this economic dynamism. So this is all, very exciting in development terms. But when we looked at these trends, we also looked at, well, what could stand in the way of further human development advances in these fast-moving countries? We came up with some quite interesting factors to be taken into account. The first was what's happening to the demographics of these countries. In fact, what's happening to the demographics of the world. Obviously, world population is growing rather fast. It will reach at least 9.6 billion people by 2050. That's 2.4 billion more than we have on our planet today. And this trend will be associated with rapid urbanisation and with ageing. These are both very important considerations for planning. Now, our report notes, as do many writers on development, that countries in the developing world with these very large populations of young people have a big opportunity to benefit from a demographic dividend of a big working age population. However, just as in business terms, you don't get a dividend unless you invest in the business. Unless you actually invest in your youth and their potential, you won't get a dividend either. And the potential for a dividend can turn into a potential for instability and disorder if you don't act very proactively to engage your young people, educate, upskill, create work opportunities. And the demographic dividend could be a demographic time bomb if that is not attended to. Now, there are some countries in the developing world, notably in East Asia, which are already starting to see quite significantly sized ageing populations. This is not unusual to us in Western countries where the older population demographic is becoming significantly larger. But for developing countries, there's a new set of policies to produce to cope with this. Greater productivity, for example, to maintain output from a workforce which is the lowest share of the population. Greater demand for pensions, for care and support services. These things have to be budgeted for. And then I mentioned urbanisation. Generally, projections are that most of this extra 2.4 billion people we expect to be among us by 2050 will be absorbed in the world's cities, not in the world's rural areas. So the quality of urban leadership is going to be enormously important. Now, we take a great interest in what is happening in China with urbanisation. And just in September, when I was in China, I was part of the launch of their National Human Development Report, which we contributed to, on sustainable and livable cities. And this argues, somewhat bravely, that if you want to optimise the benefits of urbanisation, then there is a trade-off of slower aggregate GDP growth than the rapid urbanisation scenario would produce. If you want to bring higher human development benefits in the form of better living conditions and a reduction in environment-related poor health outcomes, you need to be fairly careful about the pace of urbanisation. Just to complete on the picture of the demographic pressures, more people create more needs. The US National Intelligence Council is estimating that by 2030, our world will need 35% more food, 40% more water, and 50% more energy. It's going to be a big challenge to meet those needs in a rather climate-stressed planet without pushing it further towards its natural limits. So that rather leads me on to the second set of challenges that we identified in the way of sustaining human development progress. confronting the environmental pressures. And around 2 years ago, we devoted the Human Development Report to the issue of equity and sustainability, and did some projections with a range of scenarios about what would happen if the world became more equal and tackled environmental degradation seriously, through to worst case scenarios of what if the trends we see at the moment get somewhat worse. And on the worst case scenario, which one has to say on the present settings is not an unrealistic one, you would find 2.7 billion more people living in extreme poverty, which would be a horrible thing. You would see human development progress slow to a crawl in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, and possibly regress in some countries. Now, it doesn't have to be that way. There are obviously proven policies and ways of tackling growing inequality and environmental degradation, but it's going to take a lot of concerted action for that to happen. The third point we identified as a barrier was the issues of inequality, exclusion and discrimination. Now, we can make a general point, and I'll come back to it, that growth has usually been more effective at reducing poverty in countries with low income inequality than in countries with high income inequality. The more unequal, the harder it is to get traction on poverty eradication and human development. So it's going to be very important for countries wanting to continue to move up in human development to be addressing those issues. And then the fourth point, and possibly a more controversial point in some countries, is the issue of people having voice and being able to participate in the decision-making in their society. If you look at the whole concept of human development, as it was set out by the Nobel laureate, Amartya Sen, and his partner, Dr. Al-Haq from Pakistan, they saw political freedoms, freedom of expression, as very much part of human development. They saw enlarging the choices people have, the capabilities people have, as requiring much more open systems of politics and public discourse. And our report, picking up that theme, argues that governments that don't respond to their citizens' needs and don't widen opportunities for political participation do risk losing their legitimacy. And I think if one thinks of what's been happening in the Arab States region for over the past 3 years, you can see the seeds of some of that there. Now, more generally, we have been seeing many countries, rich and poor, including a number of the fast-moving emerging economies, experiencing very significant levels of protest and discord. Their citizens are complaining about decisions which they see impacting on them, but which they had little or no say on. So this issue of the quality and the responsiveness of the political and governmental process is becoming a significant issue, and I'm going to come back to that. But I want to move from that focus on the developing countries to saying that it's not just developing countries that are facing significant constraints on further progress. Actually, the whole world is facing rather major and somewhat intractable challenges. And these include, generally, persistent high income inequality, inequality of opportunity, and other non-income disparities. Now, this is becoming an issue that is discussed not just in the circles of sociologists and researchers and civil society advocacy organisations. It's now a topic that is preoccupying business leaders, meeting at Davos and elsewhere, that this growing gap in many countries is extremely destabilising. And if we're looking for a more peaceful and prosperous world, something much greater across rich and poor countries has to be done about rising levels of inequality. Secondly, the issues of environmental degradation and global warming are of significance to all of us, threatening health and livelihoods of people around the globe. Thirdly, we have the jobs crisis, a crisis in rich and poor countries. It's estimated by the International Labour Organization that more than 34 million workers lost their jobs with the onset of the global financial crisis. And an additional 185 million workers joined the ranks of the working poor, who live on under $2 US a day. We're still expecting unemployment to rise this year at the global level. Looking ahead, just to keep unemployment at the present high levels around the world, you would need another 600 million jobs over the next 15 years, and it's a little bit of a puzzle in the current global economic circumstances to see where those jobs will come from. Then the fourth overall constraint that I wanted to talk about was the sad perennial of war and conflict and its spillover effects. The World Bank has estimated that more than 1.5 billion people around the world live in countries badly affected by armed conflict and fragility. Now, the toll of that is obviously the greatest on the people who live in those countries, but there are spillover effects which can go far beyond that. Take, for example, the spillover effects from Syria, the refugee crisis in the near region. Refugee flows now, meaning that refugees are becoming significant and growing proportions of the population of little countries like Jordan and Lebanon, and lifting levels of tension and raising a range of issues about whether the society can provide for the education and health and accommodation and energy and water and jobs and livelihood needs of both their own citizens and those who have come in. Of course, scarce resources that are really needed for development also are impacted on by the scale of humanitarian relief which the world is regularly called on to provide. Where there's conflict. If you look at the budget for UN peacekeeping, it's currently running at an annual level of over $7.5 billion a year. That's more than goes through the UN Development Programme. The force in Darfur alone costs close to $1.4 billion a year. In Democratic Republic of Congo, $1.46 billion. Haiti, Ivory Coast, South Sudan, over $500 million a year for basic peacekeeping. This is very costly. And then there's the issue of the cost of organised crime and of violence and of citizen insecurity. There are a lot of countries with these chronic crime waves who are diverting money from development to law and order enforcement. And one of the things we're focusing our attention on is more comprehensive approaches to citizen insecurity and violent conflict in a country, and looking at it as a development issue rather than as purely a law and order issue. We have a human development report coming out next month on Latin America on that issue. So, taken together, the very big challenges which face us as a global community call for a shift in the way we think about and do development. One which brings together economic and social progress with environmental sustainability, and also specifically recognises the role of peace and security, democratic governance, the rule of law, gender equality, and human rights as very important factors in development and global peace and progress. And interestingly, the UN member states had a leader-level meeting on the Millennium Development Goals and the post-2015 Development Agenda 3 weeks ago in New York, and agreed that these factors should be being written into the next global development agenda. Now, let me come back to this issue of what do people want around the world for the future, because in the process of talking about the post-2015 development agenda, those of us working in the UN development system said it's not good enough just to hear from the member states of the United Nations. The United Nations Charter starts with the words, "we the peoples." It doesn't say "we the member states," but usually the United Nations interacts with the member states. We said, let's hear what people are saying out there about the future they want, which was the sort of chapeau wording for the Rio conference. But before coming to what people were saying to us in the huge global conversation that we facilitated, of course we were doing it against a background of this incredible wave of protest going on around the world. And let me comment first on the protests that we've seen in these major emerging economies. Interestingly, in countries where living standards have been lifting and the middle class was growing in size. But expectations and aspirations tend to rise faster than living standards, and governments are being held more to account than ever before by this rising middle class. Now, Brazil was one of the countries which experienced this huge wave of protest. And interestingly, former President Lula wrote about the protests in the New York Times recently, and he said, "Many analysts are attributing these recent protests to a rejection of politics. But I think," Lula said, "it's precisely the opposite. They reflect a drive to increase the reach of democracy and encourage people to take part more fully." I thought that was a very constructive comment on the community level protest. When we look at these protests, they're sparked by quite a wide range of grievances. Some originally focus on environmental issues, like the protests in Turkey. Others on poor job prospects, particularly for young people. Food and fuel price spikes in a number of countries in recent years have led to waves of protests. Issues of corruption in other countries. Failures to ensure the security of citizens, including in protecting women from sexual violence. This triggered big protests in India with the tragic events and cases reported there in recent months. But there's a common thread running beneath all of these, and it is concern about the performance of governments. Francis Fukuyama, commenting on this in June, said, "Isn't the theme which is connecting these recent events in Turkey and Brazil to each other, as well as to the so-called Arab Spring and the ongoing protests in China, isn't it about the rise of a new global middle class?" And he went on to say that even when the protesters live in countries that hold regular democratic elections, they feel alienated from the ruling political elite. So there's quite a lot of commentary now around this view of a growing global middle class in the South with high expectations for better public services and more accountable and transparent and honest government. Now, this, of course, is not merely a middle class priority. The profile of many of the protesters, younger, more educated, wealthier, with access to the latest ICTs to help mobilise them, is distinct. But this call for change and for better and more responsive governance is more universal across developed and developing countries. And on the point of the developed countries, have they not also seen their share of outrage on the streets, in the Occupy movements, at the consequences of poor economic performance, high unemployment, cutbacks in social provision? In democratic countries, you have mechanisms and institutions which provide some shock absorbers. In the end, people can vote a government out. But the context within which many governments are working now is such that new governments often quickly become as unpopular as the one they just replaced. And I think this points to a more fundamental challenge in the body politic around the world. Every country is facing the fallout from these huge global challenges, but there are limits to what a country acting on its own can do to mitigate the impact on its people. And I would say that that is why you need some renewed energy going into multilateralism, but multilateralism also, and multilateralism we're talking about the United Nations system, the international financial institutions, currently is suffering some skepticism about its level of legitimacy because of the governance. Is the Security Council representation fair? Is the IMF quota allocation fair? Is the way the World Bank is governed fair? All these issues are being raised. This is a whole lecture topic in its own right. But at the very time you need renewed multilateralism, there are a lot of issues over legitimacy. So coming then from that point about legitimacy, to design a global development agenda which doesn't listen to what the citizens of the world are taking would be rather foolish. And that is why in the United Nations we said, well, we're going to go out and engage very, very widely with people. This has led to 88 national consultations around the world, engaging around 300,000 people in face-to-face meetings. These have mainly been in developing countries. There's been a huge My World survey, which has reached more than 1 million people in every country on Earth, both through social media and through conventional means. You know, not every marginalised citizen, in fact, most marginalised citizens don't have access to the internet to answer a survey. So people literally went out with their clipboards and bits of paper and interviewed people to try and get feedback. You know, what kind of future do people want for our world? What should the priorities be? And what has come through is a very strong emphasis on quality education and health. But interestingly, in every region of the world, honest and responsive government is ranked as a very high priority. And from UNDP point of view, we say that governance, better governance, is an important development objective in its own right and is also a critical enabler for achieving a whole range of other goals, including eradicating poverty and lifting human development. In these global consultations, people are also focusing on the inequalities issue. There's a strong sense that the world as it is unfair to many people. They speak of inequalities, obviously, between rich and poor, women and men, rural and urban areas, between different ethnic and faith groups, and on many other dimensions. The voice of people with disabilities has been very loud. People wanting visibility, wanting equal opportunity, wanting decent services. And interestingly also, people are saying, don't deal with these issues in silos. They are very interrelated. You know, the poorest people on Earth depend so much on the state of the natural ecosystem for their survival and well-being. If that ecosystem suffers, then the poor suffer the most as well. So deal with these issues in an integrated way. So where do we go from here on this agenda? Well, I think anyone interested in this topic should have a look at the report of the high-level panel on post-2015 written for the Secretary-General. It's a panel that was co-chaired by the President of Indonesia, President of Liberia, Africa's first woman president, and the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. This report calls for a paradigm shift in development. And it's critical to note that this paradigm shift, this transformative approach, they say needs to apply to all countries on the basis we are all in this together. If our neighbour is poor, we may not necessarily be poor too, but we will certainly be poorer than we otherwise would be. If others are experiencing war and conflict, the ripple effects go far beyond those national borders. And when we reflect on the attacks like those on New York's Twin Towers, the London Underground, Madrid's commuter trains, Nairobi's Westgate shopping mall, we can see that problems in one place can have ripple effects far, far, far away, and devastating effects. If the planet's carrying capacity is nearing its limits on current modes of production and consumption, something has to change. So what we're challenged to do is think rather differently about development and see it as a shared challenge for rich and poor countries. So this panel suggested 5 big transformative shifts in our thinking and the way in which we plan and act on development. First shift, leave nobody behind. And that really speaks to the corrosive effects and the basic injustice of high levels of inequality. Also speaks to the unfinished business of the Millennium Development Goals. Millennium Development Goal 1 says halve the proportion of people in the world from 1990 to 2015 who are living in extreme poverty. Well, that's great if you're in the half that got shifted, but half didn't, and that's 1 billion people. So in saying leave no one behind, that's a very ambitious goal. And it means eradicating extreme poverty in Afghanistan, in Somalia, in Democratic Republic of Congo, in Central African Republic, in Mali, in countries presently with a great many challenges. It's an ambitious goal, but we should aim for it. Gross inequality is not sustainable if we have a vision for global peace and prosperity. It is destabilising, it can be explosive, and it's limiting the potential of individuals and of whole countries. So this leave no one behind focus is, in my view, extremely important. Secondly, the panel talks about putting sustainable development at the core of the new agenda. Now, the world has been talking about this since the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, but there has been too little action. And too often, when you talk sustainable development, you run into people saying, but this is going to affect my right to development. You know, poverty eradication, that's what I really have to drive on. But these are not opposites. We have to come up with better sets of policies which lift people's prospects without wrecking the planet. And that's going to mean a new global agreement on climate, massive investments in the infrastructure needed for a green economy, and changes in the way we produce and live. Big changes. Third major transformative shift, they say, is transform economies for jobs and inclusive growth. Well, I've mentioned the scale of the jobs crisis. I think you can combine the green economy shift with the shift to a job-rich economy. The green economy can be a tremendous generator of new jobs, exports, products, goods and services, and growth. Its potential can't be underrated. Their fourth big shift, they say, build peace and effective, open and accountable public institutions. Now, this is starting to get some traction to look at the importance of peace and justice and rule of law and better government and its role in development. And the truth is, you can't get much traction in development in countries which are ravaged by conflict, where the rule of law isn't established, where the state is weak, where there's corruption. And so in development thinking, we need to be focusing a lot more on those issues and how you make changes which will be conducive to development. The fifth big shift was about a new global partnership on development. And there I want to come back to the role that these fast emerging and growing and confident countries in the South can play. In our Human Development Report, we say that the countries of the South should assume more responsibility on the global stage in these areas, in line with the increasing economic power and political clout. And we think that could include allocating more of the South's substantial reserves for development. Our Human Development Report calculated that if you were to allocate just 3% of the liquid international reserves of the 9 G20 emerging economies into sub-Saharan Africa and into South Asia, you would lift public investment in those countries close to the average level of public investment for all developing countries. It would be very, very powerful. But the contribution can also include sharing the successful policies, ideas, experiences, innovations within the South itself. And there are many, for example, in social inclusion, social protection, restoring hope in marginalised communities. Look at some of the things which have been done in Brazil to really focus on driving down inequality and driving down poverty. There's a lot to share here. And interestingly, as the countries of the South are growing their involvement in development cooperation, you're starting to get a much broader debate about it, not just talking about aid effectiveness, because aid is a very tiny part of the overall makeup of development finance, but overall development effectiveness, what is really going to change things. Now, when we look at the big new global partnerships for development, we know the role of the traditional donor country, Australia, New Zealand, Britain, United States, Japan, the other countries of Europe. We can see a role for the fast-growing emerging economies with the resources and experiences that they have. We look at what is the role for the big multilateral institutions, the United Nations, the international financial institutions. It's really rather an important one because we coordinate the development of these agendas. We coordinate partnerships, we convene, we network. Sometimes I hear people say, is the United Nations as effective or relevant anymore? I say, well, I can only report what I observe, that every year to the United Nations, rather more than 100 world leaders come, and in a particularly big year with a big summit, you might get 150. On the sidelines, there are meetings on every major issue, whether it's Syria, whether it's how you support Yemen, whether it's the Great Lake regions, whether it's the Sahel, whether it's Afghanistan. And in most years, you have a huge number of events around development as well. We have huge convening power. But our legitimacy, as I've emphasised, is also going to be very dependent on the extent to which we engage with networks of citizens, the extent to which we do this outreach and are able to reflect back to the member states and the governments what the global opinion coming through is. Now, the 1 million voices global conversation was very much about this. But here's a warning. If 1 million plus people give voice to what they expect global development agenda to be like, and then are not listened to, that can breed cynicism. So I think it's going to be very important that our member states do reflect on the voices from the grassroots of the world's community. In the expanded partnerships for development, we should certainly be taking on board what the role of the private sector can be, and that role can be over and beyond the sheer act of employing and investing. Hopefully the role is around the creation of decent work and livelihoods. There's a role in the innovation. There's a role for creating space and value chains for the micro businesses and SMEs in developing countries. There's a role in upskilling. There's the spin-offs that can come from infrastructure development. And if the private sector operates in an environmentally and socially responsible way, that is a huge benefit for development. So let me end by drawing some conclusions from the points that I've made. Firstly, the rise of developing countries in economic and geopolitical terms is transformational, and it has the potential to make even greater contributions to human development and sustainable development. The future prospects of all of us are going to depend on the extent to which leaders and we, the citizens in North and South, are prepared to follow more sustainable and inclusive and equitable development paths, and that's going to require some bold action. The contributions the countries of the South themselves are making to development, intellectual, economic, social, geopolitical, are very numerous and will play a critical part not only in meeting the Millennium Development Goal agenda, but also shaping the next development agenda. But the continuing contributions of what has been the rich world as well are extremely important, which is why a return to economic good health for the developed economies is so vital. Am I optimistic? Yes. You don't work in development unless you're optimistic by nature. And I think that extended global partnerships around a big vision, transformational agenda, can change the course of history, can overcome gross inequality, lack of enough paid work and livelihoods, can overcome economic ecosystem depletion, can overcome poor governance and war and conflict. Without a bold agenda and effective multilateralism, the prospects would be rather bleak, but it doesn't have to be that way. And I think the exercise of global citizenship, which recognises that we are much more likely to find solutions by working together than through separate actions by nations and sectors and organisations, is most certainly the way forward. And that's the spirit in which we in UNDP are tackling our contributions to the next global development agenda. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ms. Clark. I'll thank you more at length at the end of the evening, but I know you've agreed to take some questions. And so if people have questions, if they could come to the microphones either in this aisle or in that aisle, that would be terrific. Yes, there's one just here.
I'd be very interested if you have anything to say about the rule of law in global terms, because it seems to me that the problem with what we conceive as the rule of law is that its fundamentals are part of the problem rather than part of the solution. And I'm thinking in particular of commercial in confidence behaviour and legal privilege, which renders most of the public service little more than a rubber stamp for a set of principles which belong primarily to feudal behaviour rather than democratic behaviour. And it's not called the Fourth Estate for nothing. I'd be very interested in any comments you might make about what you see as the future role of the media globally and the concept of the rule of law in comparison with corruption, because as far as I was concerned, the sale of WSN in New South Wales by New South Wales government and the probity officer and UBS and Treasury and Gilbert and Tobin were as corrupt as I can think of.
Rule of law and the media.
Well, I mean, the rule of law has to be just by definition, otherwise we're not talking rule of law. And it's extremely important. The General Assembly last year devoted a high-level event to the rule of law. It's really getting traction is extremely important in development. On the role of the media, I mean, you're right, it's traditionally called the Fourth Estate. But the ability of the media to hold decision makers to account is extremely important in an open society, to expose corruption, to expose scandal. I think the concern about media is concentration of media ownership now. But then to some extent that's being circumvented also through social media, where people depend perhaps less on the established media channels for information than they ever did. I think one of the things that will be really important in education will be media literacy, so that people are better able to judge the quality of the information that they're getting. But I have no doubt of the importance of the role of media.
What I want to ask about is your optimism in development. It's fantastic. The BRICS nation you mentioned, the middle class education in China and indeed Russia. How do we convey to them when there's an issue globally that we need to move quickly through social media, which you briefly mentioned? We need to get into Syria quickly. Russia says no. China says no. How do we help that process become a bit more efficient? I'm not saying let's rush into it, but communication, a bit more understanding. So African issues could occur, South American issues could occur, if you can, and plus your expectations when you arrived in the UN as opposed to when you were in New Zealand. How has that changed as well? Two questions.
Well, I think I went with my eyes pretty wide open. The UN has a span of opinion in it, which is far wider than the span of opinion to be found in a New Zealand or an Australian Parliament. Of course, it's difficult to reach agreement because there are very real differences, and Syria illustrates that tragically. We've watched a tragedy unfolding there now for 2.5 years, and it's been very difficult to get traction on an international solution. But this tragedy with the use of the chemical weapons in the past couple of months proved to be a catalyst, actually, for more progress in diplomatic sense on the Syrian crisis than had been seen for the 2.5 years. And the UN was able to move back into centre stage with the weapons inspection, with Syria then coming under huge pressure to accede to the Chemical Weapons Convention, now with the demolition squads going in to get rid of the weapons. Will a conference be able to be held that a reasonably wide range of the Syrian actors and their sponsors offshore will come to try and broker an outcome? It's extremely, extremely complicated. But hard as it is to find agreement and common ground on those issues, you have to keep trying, because in the end, jaw is always better than the alternative. And we've seen the horror of the alternative in Syria, including the use of those horrendous weapons. So we have to keep working at the diplomacy and making the international mechanisms work as best we can.
Between South, North and South, yeah? You think at the time the United Nations left the game to become a real administration of the world?
No, I don't think so. That's often taken as code for, quote, world government. No, the world is made up of nation states. But one of the points I made was that actually a lot of these challenges are beyond the ability of nation states to deal with. You need more effective and coordinated global action, multilateral action. And if the international institutions don't provide that, new ones come up in their place. So you look, for example, at the development of the G20 as a leader-level summit, lifted above finance ministers to leader level. And that, did quite well in the response to the global crisis. But I think since the crisis went, it started to find it's not so easy to get agreement either. We do need the formal multilateral institutions to work, not to make decisions for individual countries, but to set expectations, norms, devise collective solutions to the problems we share.
Thank you very much for generously sharing your knowledge and expertise and optimism with us this evening. I'm Stephanie Short, medical sociologist from Health Sciences here at the University of Sydney. I've got many questions for you, but I'm going to ask you one on behalf of my students who are constantly asking me, I want to work in development. How can I work in development? So I'm going to ask you if you could give us some very concrete or perhaps practical advice on the do's and don'ts of our very bright and capable students who are wanting to contribute to human development.
I mean, and many do, and there are opportunities. One thing to watch out for is probably every 3, 4 or 5 years, the UN runs a competitive entry examination for young professionals. And the eligibility is you have to have completed a bachelor's degree and you compete in an exam. It could be in an economic and social stream or in a peace and security kind of stream. I mean, there's huge competition to get into these exams, but I meet people who've come into the UN through precisely that process. So that can lead to a kind of mainstream UN career. But then there's, apart from that exam, which is conducted for the UN Secretariat, there are the many UN organisations. Mine is the lead in the UN development system, but we're not the only one. UNICEF, UN Population Fund, on the humanitarian end, the World Food Programme. The UN Development Group, which I chair, has about 28 different entities in it. So it's worth saying to students, follow all the job sites on Twitter, at UN Jobs, at UNDP Jobs, follow the individual websites and look at what organisation you think best matches your own interests. For many people, they'll be drawn to UNICEF to work with children. They may be drawn to work with World Food Programme because they really want to help the most desperate people. They may be drawn to UN Population Fund because it works on sexual and reproductive health and population issues, which are very important. UNDP is a big sort of general development agency, works across sustainable development, governance, disaster preparedness and response, crisis prevention and recovery. So there are quite a lot of ways in, and for those with an adventurous spirit who are prepared to go to countries which aren't on the tourist map, there are most certainly opportunities. Some, of course, are quite dangerous. In Somalia, our office was the target of a terrorist bombing in June, and 8 people were killed in that. Needless to say, we have quite a number of international staff vacancies. It's not easy. And we do our best to provide security, but in the end, if people are prepared to kill themselves to kill you, it's almost impossible to make your premises bullet and bomb-proof, unfortunately. But anyway, there is work out there. It is challenging work, but people, we have very, very committed people who love the challenge.
Hi, Helen. It's a pleasure to meet you at last, because I worked for UNDP for more than 5 years in the field, but this is the closest you and I have been to each other. So, so I'm glad that it's taken me to come to Sydney on my break to have the chance to meet you. I want to ask you a little bit about how you think UNDP is going forward, because while we know UNDP has incredible convening power as a leader of the UN development system and the leader of the resident coordinator system on the ground, UNDP, sort of the way UNDP itself works is still by and large on smaller scale projects of 1 to 3 years duration of a couple $1 million, and UNDP hasn't really moved itself yet to a sort of the policy, development policy excellence kind of organization that Mark Mellor Brown was trying to introduce about 10 years ago. Where do you see UNDP itself changing with the changing in development landscape?
Well, development isn't going to be speeded up by a series of small projects. That's the truth. You need to have a bigger picture vision than that. I mean, there is room for the small project, and many NGOs have wonderful small projects, but Where we are trying to pitch is at the level of policy, innovation, ideas, pilot things which can then be taken by a government and scaled up. I mean, that really is the focus. If you ask policymakers in the very large emerging economies like China and India, you know, what is the use of UNDP to you? They will say your ideas. We need your ideas. We know you're out there working in every developing country. We know that you see a lot of things that work and you see what doesn't work. We need your ideas and your experiences. We want to be networked into what's going to move fastest for us. And my impression is that even in the poorest countries, which are stable, there's a very high level of ambition. You go to Ivory Coast, which has been through years of hell with civil war and bad governments, very contested election result a couple of years ago, which led to another spate of killing and despair. But you go there, you know, they're saying our vision is to be an emerging economy by 2020. You know, they want to move forward. And I remember when I was in Ivory Coast about a year and a bit ago, I went out to see a small project, which was in a village, a fishing village, where the Norwegian government and the Irish governments had supported UNDP to help a fishing co-op. And the fishing co-op had been able to get a proper business model, buy bigger boats, and get a freezer to put the fish in so that they could keep it for market. And the Ivory Coast media all clustered around and said, you know, is UNDP going to do more of these projects? I said, probably not. They said, why not? This is so successful. I said, because your government needs to take the example of this and build it into an entrepreneur strategy for young people and develop mechanisms of funding it. You know, UNDP doing this here or that there isn't going to make the difference. We have shown proof of concept. You know, this works. Now build it into the policy of the country and the budget of the country. So that's where we're trying to push things.
Thank you very much for your talk, and also particularly your optimism. And I think your optimism, or the level of optimism, is probably the answer to my question, but nevertheless I will ask my question. I want to come back to the issue of partnership, the need for partnership, particularly between North and South, which already has been raised by one of the questions here. Now, can you just give us a bit more points on how it can really work in practice, particularly in very, very vexed and difficult areas? And I specifically was thinking, when you were talking about partnership of issues and issues like that, in areas like Afghanistan, where after all these years, we're really not getting that much closer to any real solution and a partnership to find proper solutions to the problems there. Now, we've had Karzai recently wanting to invite the Taliban to join in the government, but can that really happen? I mean, already you've got issues like women's rights and et cetera, et cetera. So could you just give us some quick points about how partnership can really work, where you often don't have a level playing field, or the other side just don't want to play ball?
Well, I'm a strong believer in trying to get warring elements into a political process. And if I took an example that wasn't Afghanistan, but is not irrelevant, it's Colombia, which has had a debilitating conflict going for more than half a century. Now, at the present time, one of the main warring parties, the FARC, and the government of Colombia are engaged in negotiations. They sit in Cuba and they've been talking for many months. When I went to see the president, I said, what's the strategy here? He said, it's simple. He said, we want them to exchange bullets for votes, right? Stop fighting and come into the political process. Now, I personally think that should be the objective in Afghanistan. Exchange bullets for votes. You know, bring people into a political process where the differences can be hammered out. One would like to see that as the path that Syria could get on to eventually too, but the longer the wretched conflict has gone on there, the more rather extreme groups have come to dominate the military struggle, and getting them into a political process would not be a short-term project.
Hi there, Ms. Clark. Thanks so much for addressing us today. My name is Mariah Okoroa, and I'm currently studying a Bachelor of International and Global Studies in third year at Sydney University. My question is, do you believe that there is an ability to redirect aid from governments who are perceived as illegitimate by their civilians populations to the control of the communities who do need it most?
Well, there are a range of countries where, not a lot of the money from partners goes through the governments because there's not so much faith in the governments. You could take Zimbabwe as an example, where the Western donors have held back for a lot of years because of what was happening in the country. But there was still quite a lot of support for the community-based efforts and for humanitarian relief. It is very difficult operating in a range of countries. And what, again, we try to do through a developmental approach is to work away on how you expand the quality of government, try to get it to open up, try to deal with corruption, try to deal with these issues of legitimacy, try to have a proper electoral process. But of course it's not unknown for elections to be stolen. They tend not to be the ones we're involved in because the UN sets quite a lot of criteria about where it engages. But countries which are seen to be particularly gross human rights violators don't attract a lot of official development assistance, and if it is going in, it tends to be going through NGOs and at a level where the government can't get its hands on it.
Hi, good night. Thank you for your exposition. I'm a student in development studies, and I also believe that the sign of a good, healthy economy is good for the future of development. The private sector is key in this, and as you mentioned, it's crucial for businesses to achieve more socially and environmentally more socially equitable and environmentally conscious operations. What is the role UNDP will take specifically on this matter?
With the private sector? We work in a number of ways with the private sector. We don't see it as a cash cow. That's not the way it operates, and it's not the way we operate. But we look for relationships with a company to develop its business model so it can be a win-win for the company and a win-win for local people and communities. And as I said, that could be by creating opportunities in the value chain for the smallholder, the micro-business to have an opportunity to develop. I think there's been some quite exciting work led by UNDP on what we call green commodity platforms, where you work with the smallholders, small growers, the big international buyers, and with governments to lift the value of the production: sustainable cocoa, sustainable coffee, sustainable pineapples. The palm oil issue is quite an important one, to certify that palm oil is not coming from recently deforested land put into production. So we can work in all those sorts of ways. Interestingly, in China, our support has been enlisted to sort of raise the game of Chinese companies on their international engagement. Now, no company particularly wants to be in the headlines back home for bad practices offshore. We know what happens in an open democratic country. If a company behaves offshore, you're going to hear about it. It's going to be plastered over the front pages. It's going to affect your share price. It's going to affect the sale of your goods in markets which judge things ethically. In China, a business that creates bad publicity for China isn't welcomed either. And so their companies are having to think about these issues. So we have got some collaboration going there, talking with the companies about what kind of support do you need to be conscious of the environmental, social, other impacts that you're having. How can you be more corporate responsible citizens, etc. So that just some of the kinds of things we do.
Last two questions, one here and then there.
Hi, Helen. Thank you for coming to speak to us today. My name is Caroline Marahasi. I'm a third-year political economy student at Sydney University. I recently had the good fortune of embarking on a university-funded research trip to Kenya in July, and my main research area was around the economic effects of women not participating in education in Kenya due to poor menstrual health provision. Now, with all due respect, I had some meetings with the chief economist for UNDP, and I found there was a real difficulty in getting any kind of recognition that women's menstrual health issues can be an economic problem. I was just wondering, with a robust amount of data showing that overall GDP growth could increase between 1% to 3% for entire nations if women could get the provisions to go to school. Now, I was just wondering if you had any ideas about how we can go about getting often taboo subjects such as women's menstrual health that have incredible economic impacts on the agenda.
Well, I suspect it's not only a UNDP economist in Kenya, which wouldn't be so aware of that, how many economists would take into account generally that, but they should. I mean, you're right. If women can't, go to work because they don't have, access to, sanitary pads, Tampax, whatever, of course that's going to affect the economy. And I am a little horrified to think that, UNDP economists would not be more gender sensitive than that. So maybe I need to do a little bit more digging in that particular office. Yeah, but maybe I assume it was a guy. A lot of economists tend to be guys, and it's just. It is a challenge, isn't it, to get a gender-sensitive lens put across all policy. And, I have been communicating ever since I came to UNDP that we have to be the strongest champions and supporters of the UN Population Fund, which works on sexual and reproductive health and access to commodities and services and so on. So, yep. That's your comment is a good reminder of the challenge that we face.
Thank you, Helen, for coming along tonight. I was particularly freaked out, quite frankly, on some of the statistics you had on growth. Given the challenges that we're currently facing in terms of climate change, which is an issue here in Australia, which seems to be quite polarising for a Kiwi to see that. And seeing what ground we make with that is quite interesting, given the carbon tax, etc., and the Abbott government coming in. I'm quite interested in your views in terms of what the current challenges are for the planet on climate change, how developing countries can actually contribute to innovation, etc., technologies that can move us away from basically Greenland slipping off its landmass. And particularly emissions trading schemes, in particular where I was witnessing your own party in New Zealand bringing forward emissions trading schemes, which is one of the first in the world. But also seeing now that, it's $2 a tonne there, when it was, suggested that the modelling at the time was about $25 a tonne. So seeing behavioural change at $25 a tonne is quite different to $2 a tonne. So how do you see your role, and I guess your agency's role, with climate change and mechanisms that go beyond just high level to mid-ground in terms of, say, emissions trading versus direct action, which the Abbott government's proposing now, and whether you see any recommendations or worldwide trends moving to or from emissions trading?
Well, you have to work out what it is that's going to change behaviour of industry. The way in which we live, do you need incentives and disincentives to do that? Or are you going to dig deep into the public purse to pay for all the changes required? I think that's the issue. So generally the emissions trading systems have sought to put incentives in place to try and incentivise good behaviour that's climate friendly and disincentivise unfriendly behaviour. But it is of growing concern that very credible forecasters are saying that we're on track not for the 2-degree tipping point, 2-degree temperature rise above pre-industrial levels, but on course for a 5 to 6 degree rise. Now, if 2 degrees was a tipping point for catastrophic and irreversible climate change, what is 5 to 6 degrees? It presumably doesn't bear thinking about. So there has to be a lot more ambition in the climate negotiations and in the actions countries are prepared to take. Now, the action cannot just be by rich countries. I mean, the jargon in the climate change negotiations is always about a common but differentiated responsibility, recognising that the carbon stock in the atmosphere now has been overwhelmingly, disproportionately contributed to by the path that rich countries have taken to development. But so we have to act. We have a responsibility, and the whole notion of climate justice speaks to that. But the fast-moving emerging economies are also becoming very, very significant polluters. So China must act, India must act, Brazil must act, South Africa must act. And we have to find ways of supporting countries which aspire to the standards of living that the West has, to get there in a way that doesn't wreck the planet. Because if everybody on Earth lived like we do now, in New Zealand or Australia or in the United States or Europe, this is catastrophic. So we have to have high living standards, but base it on a different kind of economy and set of behaviours. So I think this is really quite urgent. Back in 2006 or 7, when the SYDNE report came out in Britain, he too was pointing to the cost of dealing with unmitigated growth in global emissions. And he pointed out that the longer you leave action, the more draconian the action is going to have to be and the more expensive, because you're reaching these tipping points. Now, what interests me is, given the scale of this challenge, why aren't we seeing more citizen mobilisation around it? In all truth, the citizen mobilisation is pathetic. When I compare it with great movements of my youth, what we were out on the streets on, the Vietnam War, anti-apartheid, nuclear weapons. Do you see anything like that around the issue? We did. You're right. You're absolutely right. I'm probably still out of the mines, but where is the mobilisation around these very, very critical issues? So I think that's cause for reflection, that we need the groups that are really concerned about this taking it out to a broader public. That will get government action in the end.
Well, thank you very much. I'm afraid we don't have any time for any more questions. Ms. Clark has to go off to a media appointment, but I wanted to take this opportunity to thank you personally, to thank you on behalf of the people here, and I would like to say to thank you on behalf of the citizens of the world, he says rather pompously. So why me? Why do I thank you? Well, it's not just because whatever the University of Sydney Senate think, my job is much less like being a CEO and much more like being Secretary General of the United Nations, trying to convince people in a university to cooperate. But it's because at the university we've set ourselves two tasks. The first is to harvest the intellectual resources of the university to solve pressing problems. And we've realised that to do that, you have to bring the disciplines together. So we've got 190 people working on the issues facing modern China, slightly more working on the issues facing Southeast Asia. We've got a $500 million project in obesity, diabetes and cardiovascular disease that has economists and philosophers working with physiologists, a centre on carbon, food and water that draws people from across the university. And to hear you say, actually, that's how governments are beginning to think too, was very encouraging. I know how tough it is in a university, and so to hear governments recognising the need for collective action around multidisciplinary expertise is very encouraging. But the thing that came to my mind again and again as a word as you spoke is leadership, because it's not easy. It wouldn't be easy to solve these problems if you could simply tell everybody what to do. But if you've got to, on the way, ask them their opinion, as you were suggesting you have to, at least so that they don't march in the street, that's a whole other order of complexity. And it requires leadership skills of an extraordinarily high variety. And that's why we've made that a core to our education programs. So it was encouraging for me in my day job. I don't think it could have been more intellectually stimulating for the audience here. And on behalf of the people of the world, I'd just like to say it's encouraging to see you exercising that kind of leadership with that kind of cross-disciplinary international vision, grappling with those problems with the optimism of which you so beautifully spoke. There were bits in your talk at which I thought things were looking rather gloomy, but what gave me confidence by the end was your ability to get people talking about these issues and your confidence in the UN system to convene conversations around them. So thank you for an incredibly inspiring address, and thank you for giving us your time this afternoon. And we would like, I hope you have a diplomatic locked bag or something, because these are 3 very heavy books that we would like to give you on behalf of the university.
Thank you so much.
Thanks very much.